She didn't stalk her victims down dark alleys. She didn't break into homes in the middle of the night. She smiled, sat across the table from you, and offered you food. And by the time you finished eating, your body had already begun to shut down. This is one of the most chilling cases I've come across because it takes something so pure and human, the act of sharing a meal, and twists it into a weapon. This is Murder on the Map, a series where I retell a true crime story from every country that I visited. And today, we're in Vietnam to meet a woman who earned the name the Cyanide Witch. When I traveled through Vietnam, one of the things that I noticed first was the sheer generosity of strangers and how sharing food with people is so normalized. On long bus rides, people handed me snacks with a smile. In small villages, families I had never met invited me to sit at their table, to share rice, tea, soup. Food isn't just food in Vietnam, it's a love language. It's an act of trust. It's the way that people welcome you in. And that's why this case is so disturbing, because one woman used that very gesture not to welcome, but to kill. Her name was Le Thanh Van. She was born in 1956 in Saigon, Vietnam. She came into the world during a time of political upheaval, war, and scarcity, circumstances that shaped an entire generation. She was the eldest surviving daughter in a poor but hard-working family. Her father had a steady, unglamorous job in drainage, while her mother was a midwife who spent long nights helping families bring new life into this world. Money was tight, but the family was known to be respectable, trying to scrape together anything they could to make a decent living in a time of instability. But Van herself, she stood out. Neighbors and relatives often described her as different from the other children. Where her siblings were obedient, she was defiant. Where others were affectionate, she was cold. People remembered her as sharp-tongued, argumentative, and quick to anger. Teachers noted that she questioned authority constantly, often in ways that seemed less curious and more combative. And perhaps most disturbingly, she showed flashes of cruelty, sometimes lashing out at animals, other times picking fights with children a lot smaller than her. Her early life foreshadowed the turbulence to come. She attended school, but she never finished. By her final year of high school, she dropped out, unwilling or unable to stick with it. Instead, she sought a new path, enrolling briefly in a military medical program with a focus on dentistry. For a while, it seemed like she might settle into a respectable career, but that path quickly unraveled. As the war ended and the new government imposed stricter controls, Van was arrested for attempting to cross the border illegally. Perhaps she was chasing opportunity, or perhaps she was simply restless and dissatisfied with where she was in life. Either way, it earned her 16 months in a re-education camp, a harsh environment meant to break down and reshape political prisoners. Those who knew her said she came back harder, more bitter, and even more manipulative than before. From that point on, lies and reinvention became her survival tools. She discovered that she could slip into new identities the way other people slipped into new clothes. She impersonated an army captain to gain trust and authority that she hadn't earned. She was arrested for forgery and theft, charges that hinted at her willingness to manipulate others for her own personal gain. Each time she was caught, she found a way to wiggle herself out, only to reappear later under a different guise. And then there were her marriages. Twice she married, twice she played the role of wife, and twice her husbands died, both young, both unexpectedly. They were healthy men who suddenly collapsed, their deaths explained away at the time as illness or simply bad luck. Doctors signed the papers, families grieved, and life moved on. But in hindsight, the timing was too neat, the circumstances too strange. Years later, investigators would quietly wonder, were these her first victims? Did her descent into murder begin not with strangers, but with the men who shared her home? In 1992, Van seemed to have finally found some stability. She was hired as a caretaker by a respectable family in Ho Chi Minh City. To neighbors, she appeared polite, soft-spoken, even dependable. She fetched groceries, did chores, helped with cooking. She was the kind of woman you'd never think twice about letting into your home. One evening, she prepared what should have been a simple, comforting dinner, chicken noodle soup, a dish that all families in Vietnam often share around the table at the end of a long day. The smell of broth filled the house. The family gathered together, laughing, eating, completely unaware of the danger that sat in front of them. But the warmth of the meal quickly turned into horror. Within minutes of eating, every single family member began to feel it. First nausea, then dizziness, then violent illness. The room that moments earlier had been filled with the sound of clinking chopsticks and conversation became a scene of panic and chaos. The father doubled over, clutching his stomach. Children began vomiting, unable to stand. And at the center of it all, Miss Bui, the mother, grew weaker and weaker until she collapsed. By the time they reached the hospital, it was too late. Miss Bui didn't survive. The rest of the family clung to the edge of life and death, doctors fighting desperately to stabilize them. Suspicion immediately fell on Van. She had cooked the meal. No one else had touched the food. But the police faced a devastating obstacle. Cyanide leaves little trace. It is colorless, odorless, and tasteless. To the untrained eye, and to the basic hospital labs of 1990s Vietnam, the symptoms looked like severe food poisoning. And without a witness to say they've seen her add the poison, without receipts, without physical powder, there was no way to prove murder. And Van was very clever. When questioned, she played the role of a concerned caretaker, insisting that she had only tried to help. She even claimed that she had eaten the same noodles herself, though police never found any evidence to back that up. What they could prove was theft. After the attack, valuables had gone missing from the home: jewelry, cash, and small household items. So prosecutors settled for what they had. Instead of facing murder charges, she was convicted of fraud and theft. Her sentence, just 4 years in prison. And perhaps the most chilling part, that brush with prison didn't scare her straight. It only emboldened her. And when Van walked free, she didn't stop. She escalated. By the late 1990s, Van had learned from her past mistakes. She knew that cyanide was invisible, tasteless, and difficult to prove in court. She also knew that doctors in provincial Vietnam were overworked and under-equipped, and to them, sudden illnesses looked like natural causes and not a crime. And so, starting in 1998, death began to follow her like a shadow. Her first confirmed victim that year was Van Lee, an elderly woman who was known in her neighborhood for her generosity. One hot afternoon, Van prepared a glass of lemonade for her, a drink so ordinary, so harmless, that no one could imagine the danger hiding inside. Minutes after finishing it, Lee collapsed, clutching her chest. Neighbors thought it was the heat. Maybe her age was catching up to her. But it wasn't age. It was poison, and she never made it home from the hospital. Next was Quack Min, a hard-working night security guard. He was in his 40s, with a family who relied on his modest paycheck. To everyone who knew him, he was reliable, the man who always showed up for his shifts, no matter what. After sharing drinks with Van one evening, he was suddenly struck down, violent illness that turned fatal within hours. His family believed that it was a heart attack brought on by stress and exhaustion, but Van had been there, and she had poured the drink. Then came her own family. Her mother-in-law died under suspicious circumstances, her untimely death leaving behind inheritance money that just so happened to go to Van. To outsiders, this looked like a tragic misfortune, but to those who knew her, it was the first hint that no one, not even relatives, was safe from her greed. Next, there was Win Van Sin, a neighbor who often shared tea with her. On the day he died, the tea was prepared by Van's hand. His sudden passing was written off as another unexpected illness, a cruel twist of fate. But behind closed doors, the whispers began. How could so many people fall ill after being near her? And what came next was the case that revealed just how relentless Van could be. Hong Mung Dao. She was young, strong, and healthy. At first, she collapsed after sharing a lunch with Van. Doctors rushed to her aid and even managed to save her life. Against the odds, Dao pulled through, and she might have become the one to finally expose Van's crimes. But fate had other plans. When Dao was discharged from the hospital, weak but recovering, Van came to visit her under the guise of concern. She showed up like a friend who was concerned and wanted to check in. But instead of comfort, Van brought poison again. Dao was poisoned a second time, and this time, she didn't survive. That was just how ruthless Van was. Once she set her sights on someone, she would not let go until they were gone. These deaths weren't random. They weren't accidents. Each victim had something Van wanted: land, jewelry, inheritance money, or simply the chance to eliminate someone that stood in her way. And yet, to grieving families, these deaths looked like natural tragedies: food poisoning, strokes, sudden heart failure. No one thought to question the food, because in Vietnam, food is sacred. It's hospitality, it's trust. But behind that trust, a pattern of funerals, of grief, of stolen lives, all connected to one quiet woman who always seemed to be nearby. By the late 1990s, the deaths began to look a lot less like coincidences and more like pieces of a puzzle. Investigators began to notice that in case after case, whether it was a collapse at a dinner table, a seizure after a cup of tea, or a sudden illness that seemed to come out of nowhere, one name kept appearing in the background: Le Tan Van. And these tragedies weren't just followed by grief. They were always followed by losses of a different kind. Jewelry that mysteriously disappeared, land deeds suddenly transferred, families realizing that money, heirlooms, and valuables were suddenly missing in the confusion after a funeral. It was as if death and theft traveled hand in hand, wherever she went. The common thread was her weapon of choice, cyanide. Unlike a knife or a gun, it didn't raise alarm. In rural Vietnam, where medical resources were limited, cyanide poisoning often looked like something else entirely. Families would often bury their loved ones thinking it was fate, never even realizing that they had been murdered. And what made Van so dangerous was not just her choice of weapon, but her ability to disappear. She was a master of reinvention. When suspicion began to creep in, she slipped away. She changed her name, moved to another province, and created a new identity. 1 month, she was a caretaker. Another, she posed as a dentist, telling people that she had studied medicine in Germany. In other towns, she reinvented herself as a family friend or a distant relative, and each fresh role brought her trust. Each move erased suspicion. And because the deaths were scattered across different neighborhoods and different provinces across the country, no single community ever saw the full picture. To them, it was tragedy. To her, it was an opportunity. Behind the mask of respectability, behind the warm smile and the kind gestures, lay her true motives: greed, manipulation, and control. She didn't kill in a blind rage. She killed with calculation, choosing victims who had land, valuables, or inheritances for her benefit. It was only when investigators began to compare these cases side by side that the horrifying reality became clear. These weren't isolated incidences of bad luck. They were the footprints of a killer who had learned to weaponize trust itself. By 2001, whispers of suspicion had grown too loud to ignore. Families across different provinces in Vietnam had buried their loved ones with the same haunting story: sudden illness, violent symptoms, valuables gone missing, and the quiet, watchful presence of the same woman. Investigators were desperate. They still didn't have the smoking gun to tie her to the deaths, but they didn't need to prove murder. Not yet. They just needed to catch her with the poison. And that chance finally came when police stopped her and searched her handbag. Inside, they discovered a small vial of cyanide, nearly 3 grams. To put that into perspective, that was enough to kill 20 human adults, and it was just the evidence they needed to finally bring her in. Once she was in custody, something remarkable happened. Investigators from 3 different provinces, each of whom had unsolved cases involving deaths, finally came together. For the first time, they laid their files side by side. What looked like isolated tragedies, a heart attack here, food poisoning there, suddenly connected into a single, horrifying pattern. This wasn't misfortune. This wasn't bad luck. It was a trail of calculated killings stretching across years. Vietnam had a serial killer in its midst, and the trial that followed was anything but straightforward. In court, Van presented herself as calm and even nurturing, insisting that she had only ever tried to help her victims. She pointed to moments where she had driven victims to the hospital or sat by their bedside. She played the role of caretaker to the very end. At one point, she shifted the blame entirely, accusing her own husband of being the real poisoner. But under pressure, he broke. He admitted what police had long suspected. He knew she was poisoning people, and in at least one case, he had even helped her. His testimony was devastating because it confirmed that the deaths were not accidents, not coincidences, but deliberate acts. The courtroom itself became a theater of chaos. Van fainted dramatically in front of the jury in an attempt to force pauses in the proceedings. She contradicted herself constantly, one moment claiming that she had never touched cyanide, and the next admitting that she had, but only in certain cases. At times, she played the victim, insisting that she was misunderstood. Other times, she lashed out in anger, accusing the authorities of fabricating the evidence. But the jury wasn't swayed. The case against her was too strong. The cyanide in her handbag, the stolen property traced back to her, the inheritance money she had gained after relatives mysteriously died, her husband's confession. Piece by piece, the mask slipped away. Finally, in 2003, after years of scattered suspicion, the verdict came down. She was convicted of 13 murders, along with robbery and illegal possession of poison. Yet, even as the sentence was read, investigators quietly admitted what many had already believed. The true number was much higher, likely closer to 20 lives lost, or maybe even more. Husbands, neighbors, acquaintances, and family members, all silenced by food and drink laced with cyanide. In late August 2003, Lei was sentenced to death by firing squad. Her husband Quang received a 21-year sentence for his role as an accomplice in one of the murders. In the early morning of October 26, 2005, the guards came for her. She cursed at them, fought back, and refused to eat her final meal. But before execution, Lei made one last request. She requested to have her blindfold removed. She wanted to see the sky one last time. Her request was granted, and moments later, gunfire ended her life. But her story lived on. In Vietnam, where food is sacred, her crimes left scars. Parents warned children not to accept snacks from strangers. Families grew suspicious of any unexpected gifts of food or drinks. To this day, she is remembered not by her given name, but by her chilling nickname, the Cyanide Witch.